The year was 1887, and Dusty Creek was the kind of town where miracles came disguised as hungry strangers. When young Magnolia approached the weathered cowboy at the saloon that fateful evening, asking for his leftover beans and cornbread, neither expected their lives to change forever, but sometimes God works through the simplest of moments and the hungriest of hearts. The sun hung low over Dusty Creek like a copper penny against faded denim, casting long shadows across the weathered boardwalk. Thus devils danced in the main street, and the only sounds were the creaking of the saloon's batwing doors and the distant lowing of cattle beyond the town limits. Ezekiel Zeke Morrison had been riding for 3 days straight, his faithful horse, Midnight, picking her way carefully through the rocky terrain that led into this God-forsaken settlement. His leather chaps were caked with dust, his hat brim pulled low against the dying light, and his stomach growled like a caged bear. The rusty Horseshoe Saloon stood before him like an oasis in the desert, not much to look at: weathered wood planks, a crooked sign that squeaked in the evening breeze, and windows so grimy they might as well have been painted black. But it promised hot food and cold beer, and that was all Zeke needed right now. He dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent more years in the saddle than on solid ground, tying Midnight to the hitching post with practiced ease. The mare snorted and shook her head, grateful for the rest. "Easy girl," Zeke murmured, stroking her neck. "We'll get you some oats and water directly." The saloon doors swung open with a familiar squeak as Zeke stepped inside. The interior was exactly what he'd expected: rough-hewn tables, mismatched chairs, a bar that had seen better decades, and the kind of clientele that minded their own business. Perfect. Behind the bar stood a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and a beard that could hide small animals. This had to be Tobias Milliken, the proprietor he'd heard about in the last town. "What'll it be, stranger?" Tobias asked, polishing a glass with a rag that had seen cleaner days. "Whiskey and whatever grub you got that's hot," Zeke replied, settling onto a bar stool that creaked under his weight. "Got beef stew, beans, cornbread, and if you're lucky, Widow Patterson's apple pie. All of it sounds like heaven right about now." Tobias chuckled and disappeared into the back room. Within minutes, he returned with a plate piled high with steaming food that made Zeke's mouth water. The first bite of stew was pure ambrosia: tender beef, potatoes, carrots, and onions swimming in a rich brown gravy. As Zeke ate, he became aware of a presence hovering near his shoulder. He turned slightly and saw a young woman standing a respectful distance away, her hands clasped in front of her worn calico dress. She couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, with auburn hair that caught the lamplight and skin kissed, golden by the prairie sun. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were the color of spring violets, deep and expressive, and they held a kind of quiet desperation that tugged at something deep in his chest. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, her voice carrying the musical lilt of someone raised proper despite her obvious circumstances. "I don't mean to trouble you, but may I have your leftovers, sir?" Time seemed to suspend itself in that moment. Zeke found himself staring into those violet eyes, and what he saw there nearly knocked him clean off his stool. There was hunger. Yes, but not just for food. There was a soul-deep weariness, a kind of exhaustion that came from fighting too hard for too long. But underneath it all, there was something else: a stubborn spark of dignity that refused to be extinguished. "Ma'am," Zeke said, setting down his fork and turning to face her fully. "I beg your pardon, but I don't believe I caught your name." "Magnolia Beaumont," she replied, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Most folks just call me Maggie." "Well, Miss Maggie, I'm Ezekiel Morrison, and I'd be honored if you'd join me for supper instead of waiting for my leavings." The words tumbled out before he could stop them, surprising them both. Zeke wasn't typically the charitable type. Years of hard living had taught him to look out for himself first and foremost. But something about this young woman had reached past all his carefully constructed walls. "Oh, I couldn't possibly," Maggie began, taking a step back. "Course you could," Zeke interrupted gently. "Tobias, another plate over here, if you please." The big bartender raised an eyebrow but complied without comment. In a frontier town like Dusty Creek, you learned not to question the unusual. "Really, Mr. Morrison, I couldn't accept. It ain't charity, Zeke said firmly. It's hospitality. My mama raised me better than to let a lady go hungry while I stuffed my face. Something in his tone must have convinced her, because after a moment's hesitation, Maggie slid onto the stool beside him, up close. Zeke could see the fine lines of worry around her eyes, the way her dress had been mended multiple times with careful, tiny stitches. "Thank you," she whispered, and the gratitude in her voice made his chest tight. When Tobias set the plate before her, Maggie's eyes widened at the generous portions. She picked up her fork with trembling fingers and took a small, ladylike bite, then another. Then she was eating with the controlled urgency of someone who hadn't seen a proper meal in far too long. "When's the last time you had a decent supper?" Zeke asked quietly. Maggie paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Day before. Yesterday, I reckon. Mrs. Henderson let me help with her washing in exchange for biscuits and preserves. And before that, day or two prior." She set down her fork and looked at him directly. "I ain't looking for pity, Mr. Morrison. Times are hard, is all. What happened to your folks?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire. Maggie was quiet for so long that Zeke thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Daddy died of the fever 2 winters past. Mama, she just couldn't bear it anymore. Went to sleep one night last spring and didn't wake up. Doc said her heart gave out. But I think she just didn't want to fight anymore. I'm sorry," Zeke said, and meant it. "Left me with nothing but debts and a cabin that ain't worth the nails holding it together. Been trying to make my way ever since, but work's scarce for a woman alone." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds, the clink of silverware against plates, and the low murmur of conversation from other patrons. Zeke found himself stealing glances at his unexpected dinner companion, trying to piece together her story from the small details he observed. Her hands, though work-worn, moved with the practiced grace of someone raised with proper manners. Her posture was straight despite her obvious fatigue. The way she cut her meat and dabbed at her mouth with the threadbare napkin spoke of a genteel upbringing that had fallen on hard times. "Miss Maggie," he said finally, "what are your plans? I mean, for making a living?" She looked up from her plate, those violet eyes meeting his directly. "I've been thinking about that considerable. Mrs. Patterson mentioned there might be work. At the schoolhouse come fall they need someone to teach the younger children. But that's months away, and I need to eat between now and then. Can you cook?" "Yes, sir. Mama taught me everything she knew, and she could make magic happen with nothing but flour, lard, and whatever was growing in the garden. Can you mend things? So I can patch, darn, and take in most anything that needs fixing. These hands ain't afraid of work, Mr. Morrison." Zeke leaned back on his stool, studying her face in the lamplight. An idea was forming in his mind, crazy, impractical, and probably foolish. But sometimes the best decisions were the ones that made the least sense on paper. "I got a proposition for you," he said slowly, Maggie's fork still in her hand. "What kind of proposition?" "I own a ranch about 2 days' ride south of here. Nothing fancy, just a small spread, with good water and decent grazing. Been running it alone since my partner took sick and died last year. Could use help with the cooking, mending, keeping the place from falling down around my ears. Mr. Morrison, hear me out," he continued. "I ain't talking about anything improper. There's a little cabin about 50 yards from the main house, where my partner used to live. It's got a good roof, a stone fireplace, and plenty of room for one person. You could have your privacy, your dignity, and steady work." Maggie set down her fork and folded her hands in her lap. "What would you expect in return? Honest work for honest wages, 3 meals a day, clothes mending, maybe help with the garden. I've been neglecting something fierce. I'd pay you fair wages enough to save up for whatever future you're planning. Why would you make such an offer to a stranger?" It was a fair question, and Zeke found himself struggling for an answer that made sense. Why was he doing this? He'd ridden into Dusty Creek with no intention of changing his solitary life. He'd been content with his small ranch, his cattle, and his own company. But something had shifted the moment he looked into those violet eyes. Something had recognized itself in her quiet desperation, her stubborn pride, her refusal to give up even when the world seemed determined to grind her down. Maybe because I know what it's like to be alone, he said finally. Maybe because my mama always said that when God puts someone in your path who needs help, you better pay attention. Or maybe because I can see you're the kind of person who'd work hard and treat a place with respect. Maggie was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read his true intentions. You don't know anything about me, Mr. Morrison. I could be a thief or worse. Could be. Zeke agreed. But I don't think so. Sometimes you just have to trust your gut about people. And what if I said yes? When would you want me to start? I'm planning to head back tomorrow morning. You could come with me, see the place. And if it suits you, we could work out the details. The silence stretched between them again, filled with possibility and uncertainty. Zeke found himself holding his breath, waiting for her answer. He couldn't quite explain why her decision mattered so much to him, but it did. I'd want to keep teaching in mind, Maggie said finally. If the schoolhouse position opens up come fall, I'd want the freedom to take it. Fair enough. And I'd want it understood that this is purely a business arrangement. I ain't looking for complications, neither am I, Zeke assured her, though. Something deep in his chest whispered that might be easier said than done. Maggie took a deep breath and extended her hand across the table. Then I accept your proposition, Mr. Morrison. When Zeke took her hand to shake it, he felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with the dry prairie air. Her skin was warm and calloused from work, but her grip was firm and steady. This was a woman who kept her word. Partners, then, he said. Partners, she agreed. Dawn came early to Dusty Creek, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Zeke of his childhood. Back in Missouri, he'd spent the night in the small room above the saloon, but sleep had been elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw violet ones looking back at him, and he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. Offering a job to a stranger was one thing. Bringing that stranger, especially a beautiful young woman, to his isolated ranch was another matter entirely. What would people think? What would she think when she saw the humble reality of his spread instead of whatever grand ranch she might be imagining? But when he made his way downstairs to the saloon's main room, his doubts evaporated. Maggie was already there, sitting at a small table near the window with a cup of coffee and what looked like her worldly possessions gathered in a single carpet bag that had seen better years. She'd changed from the worn calico dress into a simple traveling outfit, a dark blue skirt, white blouse, and a shawl that brought out the color of her eyes. Her auburn hair was pinned back practically, and she looked rested despite the circumstances. Morning, Miss Maggie, Zeke said, touching the brim of his hat. Good morning, Mr. Morrison. I hope you slept well. Well enough. You ready for this? She stood and smoothed her skirts. As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose. Tobias emerged from behind the bar with a cloth-wrapped bundle. Packed you some provisions for the road, he said gruffly. Jerky, biscuits, and a jar of preserves, no charge consider. It a go-in-away present. That's mighty kind of you, Mr. Milliken, Maggie said, accepting the bundle with a grateful smile. You take care of yourself, girl, and you. He fixed Zeke with a stern look. You better treat her right, or you'll answer to me. Yes, Sir, Zeke replied solemnly, understanding that the big man's gruff exterior hid a protective heart. They made their way to the hitching post where Midnight waited patiently, saddled and ready for the journey. Beside her stood a smaller bay mare that Zeke had arranged to rent from the livery stable. This here's Buttercup, he said, stroking the mare's nose. She's gentle and sure-footed. The livery owner says she's good with riders who might be a bit rusty. I haven't ridden in a while, Maggie admitted, but I grew up on a farm. I remember the basics. Zeke helped her secure her carpet bag to the saddle, his hands brushing hers as they worked together. Each contact sent that same strange electricity through him, and he found himself lingering longer than necessary. Ready? He asked, mounting Midnight with easy grace. Maggie took a deep breath and pulled herself up onto Buttercup's back, settling into the saddle with only a slight wobble. Ready. They rode out of Dusty Creek as the sun climbed higher, casting their shadows long across the dusty main street. A few early risers watched them go, the blacksmith beginning his day's work, an elderly woman sweeping her front porch, children chasing chickens in a side yard. The trail south led through rolling prairie land dotted with wildflowers and the occasional stand of cottonwoods marking a creek or spring. The air was clear and sweet, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of summer heat to come. "It's beautiful country," Maggie said after they'd been riding for an hour. "Gets in your blood." Zeke agreed. "I came out here 5 years ago, thinking I'd make my fortune and head back to civilization. But the land has a way of holding onto you." "Where are you from originally?" "Missouri. Little farm outside of Kansas City. My folks raised corn and pigs, and I was set to take over the operation until my older brother came back from the war and decided he wanted it instead." "The war between the states?" "Yes, ma'am. I was too young to fight, but Jacob served with the Missouri Volunteers. When he came home, he was different, harder. Said he'd earned the right to the family farm. That must have been difficult." Zeke was quiet for a moment, remembering the bitter arguments, the feeling of being displaced in his own home. "Sometimes the hardest thing is knowing when it's time to leave. I packed my gear, took my horse, and headed west. Never looked back." "Do you ever regret it?" "Not for a single day. This country may be hard, but it's honest. You get out what you put in. And a man can make his own way without worrying about what his family name is or who his daddy knew." They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat some of Tobias's provisions. Maggie proved to be a pleasant traveling companion, quiet when silence was called for, but ready with conversation when the miles grew long. She had a way of asking questions that showed genuine interest without being nosy, and her observations about the countryside revealed an intelligent, thoughtful mind. "Tell me about your ranch," she said as they shared the last of the biscuits. "Like I said, it ain't much, about 200 acres of good grazing land, a creek that runs year-round, and a small herd of cattle. The house is simple but solid 2 rooms, a good fireplace, and a kitchen that could use a woman's touch, and the cabin where I'd be staying. Built it for my partner, Tom Bradley. He was a good man, taught me everything I know about ranching. When he took sick with the lung fever, I nursed him as best I could." But Zeke shrugged. "The cabin's been empty since he passed. Seems like it's waiting for someone to bring it back to life." As the afternoon wore on, the landscape began to change. The rolling prairie gave way to more rugged terrain, with red rock formations and deeper valleys. The air carried the sound of running water, and Zeke's spirits lifted as familiar landmarks came into view. "We're almost there," he said, pointing to a gap between 2 low hills. "The ranch is just through that pass." When they crested the hill and the Morrison spread came into view, Zeke held his breath, waiting for Maggie's reaction. It wasn't much compared to the grand ranches he'd heard about in Texas or California, just a simple log house, a barn, a corral, and the small cabin nestled among a grove of cottonwoods. But it was home, and he'd built it with his own hands. "Oh," Maggie breathed, and Zeke's heart sank. The disappointment in her voice was clear. "I know it ain't much," he began. "It's perfect." She interrupted, and when he looked at her, tears were glistening in her violet eyes. "It's absolutely perfect." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as Zeke showed Maggie around the property. The main house was indeed simple, a large room that served as kitchen, dining, and sitting area, with a separate bedroom for privacy. The furniture was rough but well made, crafted by Zeke's own hands during the long winter evenings. "Tom and I built most of this ourselves," he explained, running his hand along the smooth surface of the kitchen table. "Pine from the mountains, oak for anything that needed to be strong. It ain't fancy, but it's solid." The cabin where Maggie would stay was a short walk through the cottonwoods, close enough for safety, but far enough for privacy. It consisted of a single room with a sleeping alcove, a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen area. The previous occupant had left behind some basic furniture: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a chest for belongings. "Tom was a neat man," Zeke said, opening the shutters to let in light and air. "Always said a clean space made for a clean mind." Maggie walked slowly around the room, touching surfaces, testing the sturdiness of the furniture. "It's wonderful," she said finally. "Better than anywhere I've lived in months." There's work to be done, Zeke warned. The garden's overgrown. The chickens need tending, and I've been living on beans and hardtack for too long. But if you're willing, I'm willing, Maggie said firmly. When do we start? They began immediately. While Maggie settled her few belongings in the cabin, Zeke tended to the horses and checked on his small herd of cattle. By the time he returned to the main house, the smell of cooking food drew him like a lodestone. Maggie had worked miracles. With his meager supplies, somehow, she'd transformed beans, bacon, and dried vegetables into a stew that smelled like heaven. Fresh biscuits cooled on the counter, and she'd even managed to find some wild greens to make a proper salad. How did you? He began. A woman learns to make do, she said with a gentle smile that lit up her face. After nothing but dry biscuits and jerky, anything warm feels like a feast. But when Zeke tasted the food, he realized she was being humble. It was the best meal he'd had since his mother's cooking soft, golden biscuits, flavorful stew, and fresh greens that brought it all together. Miss Maggie, he said after helping himself to a second plate, if you cook like this every day, I'll outgrow my saddle in no time. She laughed, her voice light and comforting. I'll try to go easy, Mr. Morrison. Call me Zeke, he replied. We're going to be working side by side, it's only fair. Zeke, she echoed thoughtfully. Then you can call me Maggie. Out here, there's no need for formal titles. After dinner, they cleaned up together in a quiet rhythm. He washed, she dried. When the last dish was put away, they sat on the porch, watching the sun slip behind the western hills. Tell me more about the work, Maggie asked, settling beside him. There's a garden that needs care. I tried after Tom passed, but growing things was never my strength. Then there are the chickens, about a dozen hens and a proud rooster. They do well, but they need daily attention. And the cattle, 50 head, mostly cows and calves, good stock, strong and reliable. But they need watching. There's a bull named Caesar, usually calm, but has his moods. I grew up around animals, she said. It's been a while, but I remember enough to help. There's also the usual mending, repairs, keeping things going. Life out here wears everything down fast. And where do you get supplies? There's a trading post half a day east. Old Murphy runs it. He's fair. I go once a month to get what we need. As the sky darkened and stars appeared, they sat quietly, listening to the wind, distant cattle, and a lone prairie bird calling out. Zeke, Maggie said softly, why did you really give me this job? He hesitated. The question had lingered in his mind too. How could he explain how everything had shifted the moment he met her? I told you the truth, he said. I needed help. You needed work. But is that all? He paused again. Maybe. I just got tired of doing it all alone. And maybe I got tired of being scared, she whispered. Scared of what? Of giving up. Of never really living life fully. In that quiet moment, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding. They didn't say it aloud, but both felt it, a new beginning. We should get some rest, Zeke said. Yes, Maggie nodded. Thank you, Zeke, for everything. And thank you for saying yes. She walked into the darkness toward her cabin, leaving Zeke alone with the stars overhead and a peace he hadn't felt in years. The following days brought a natural rhythm. Maggie rose early to tend the chickens and prepare breakfast, while Zeke checked on the cattle. The garden, once struggling, now thrived under Maggie's care. She brought life back to tired soil and coaxed new growth with steady hands. The chickens became calmer and more productive. Even Caesar seemed more at ease when she was around. Animals know when they're safe, she said one morning. They feel more than we think. Is that your secret? Zeke asked, watching her move among the hens. Partly, but mostly it's about paying attention. Each one's different. Bertha likes her head scratched. Prudence is shy. You let her come to you. You've named them. Of course. How else would I know who's who? Zeke chuckled, impressed by her attention to detail. The house, too, changed. Maggie cleaned, fixed, and brightened everything. Fresh bread baked daily. Wildflowers in mason jars graced the table. And the silence that once filled Zeke's home was now replaced with humming, laughter, and quiet conversation. You've brought music into this place, Zeke told her one evening. I guess I finally have something to sing about again. though not romantic. Their bond deepened, built on trust and shared effort. Maggie was thoughtful and well-read, often surprising Zeke with her insight. "Where'd you learn so much?" he asked after she quoted a classic book during one of their porch talks. "My mama taught me. Said education was something no one could ever take away. Smart woman. She was. She would have liked you. Was that because you helped me when I had nothing to offer?" She believed kindness meant everything. The compliment touched Zeke. He'd just done what felt right, but through Maggie's eyes, he saw himself differently. Their peaceful days were soon tested. A fierce spring storm swept in with winds and hail. They worked through the night securing the barn, moving the chickens, and protecting the cattle. By morning, they had losses, damaged plants, a few broken windows, and some chickens that didn't survive. "I'm sorry," Zeke said gently. "They were ours," Maggie replied, "and next time, we'll be better prepared." Her strength shone through the setback. She made a list of improvements: storm covers, stronger fencing, better shelter. Weeks later, another challenge appeared. 6 cows were missing. Tracks confirmed that rustlers had stolen them. "We have to go after them," Zeke said, loading his rifle. Maggie asked. "I can't leave you here, and I can't afford to lose them. They're too important." "Then we'll go together," she said without hesitation. 3 weeks into their partnership, supplies were running low, and it was time for a trip to Murphy's trading post. Zeke had made the journey dozens of times alone, but having Maggie along transformed the errand into something approaching an adventure. The trading post sat at a crossroads where the old Indian trails met. A weathered log building surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. Seamus Murphy had been trading with ranchers, trappers, and travelers for more than 20 years, and his establishment had grown into the commercial heart of the scattered community. "Zeke Morrison," Murphy called out as they approached, his Irish accent still thick after all of his years in America. "And who might this lovely lass be?" "Seamus Murphy. Meet Miss Magnolia Beaumont. She's helping me run the ranch now." Murphy's eyes twinkled with curiosity, but he was too much of a gentleman to pry. "Welcome, Miss Beaumont. Any friend of Zeke's is welcome here. What can I do for you folks today?" They worked through their list: flour, coffee, sugar, salt, and various other necessities. Murphy's shelves were stocked with everything from patent medicines to fancy fabrics, and Maggie's eyes lingered on a bolt of blue calico that matched her eyes perfectly. "That would make a fine dress," Murphy observed, following her gaze. "It's beautiful," Maggie agreed. "But practical things come first." "Nonsense," Zeke said, surprising them both. "Add 3 yards of that calico to our order, Seamus, and some thread to match." "Zeke, I couldn't call it a bonus for all the hard work," he said firmly. "A woman needs a decent dress, especially if she's thinking about teaching come fall." The pleasure that lit up Maggie's face was worth twice the cost of the fabric. Murphy wrapped their purchases with the efficiency of long practice, accepting a mixture of cash and credit that spoke to his trust in Zeke's reliability. "There's news from town you might want to hear," Murphy said as they loaded their supplies. "Sheriff Hawkins is looking for a gang that's been hitting ranches north of here. Sounds like the same varmints you tangled with. They still operating in the area. Last I heard, they were seen near Eagle Creek, about 2 days' ride from here. You folks be careful going home." The warning proved unnecessary. Their return journey was peaceful, marked only by Maggie's excitement over the fabric and her plans for the dress she would make. But Zeke found himself checking their back trail more often than usual, and he made sure his rifle was close at hand. That evening, as Maggie spread the calico across the kitchen table to plan her cutting, Zeke realized something had shifted in his feelings toward her. It wasn't just partnership anymore, or even friendship. Watching her face light up over something as simple as new dress fabric had touched something deep in his heart. He was falling in love with her. The realization should have frightened him. He'd built his life around independence and self-reliance. Love meant vulnerability, complications, and the possibility of loss. But as he watched Maggie's graceful hands smooth the blue fabric, he found he couldn't regret the feeling growing in his chest. Summer deepened across the prairie, bringing longer days and the kind of heat that shimmered off the distant hills like water. The garden flourished under Maggie's care. producing more vegetables than they could eat fresh. She spent her evenings preserving the excess, canning tomatoes, drying beans, putting up pickles and preserves for the winter ahead. You work like someone who's been hungry, Zeke observed one evening as he helped her carry jars to the cool cellar beneath the house. I have been hungry, Maggie replied matter-of-factly. More times than I care to remember. Once you've known what it's like to wonder where your next meal is coming from, you never take abundance for granted. Is that why you agreed to come here? Just for the security? Maggie paused in her work, considering the question. Partly, she admitted, but not entirely. There was something about you that night in the saloon, something that made me think you might be different from other men I'd known. Different how? Honest. Kind without expecting anything in return. My daddy was a good man, but he was weak when it came to making hard decisions. The men who came around after Mama died, they saw a young woman alone and thought they knew what that meant. Zeke felt a flash of anger at the implications. Anyone who bothered you? Nothing I couldn't handle. But it gets tiresome, always having to be on guard. Always having to prove you're not what they think you are. And you don't feel that way here. No. You've never made me feel like anything other than a partner and a friend. That's rarer than you might think. They finished their work in comfortable silence. But the conversation stayed with Zeke as they sat on the porch afterward. The night was clear and warm, perfect for watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. Tell me about your dreams, he said suddenly. My dreams? What you want for your future? Teaching, obviously, but what else? What would make you truly happy? Maggie was quiet for so long that Zeke thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and wistful. I used to dream about traveling, seeing the ocean, visiting big cities, maybe even going to Europe like the heroines in novels. But those seem like foolish dreams now. Why foolish? Because I've learned that happiness isn't about where you are or what you see. It's about having people who matter to you and mattering to them in return. It's about building something worthwhile with your life, and you think teaching would give you that? Maybe. I like the idea of helping children learn, of opening their minds to possibilities they might not see otherwise. There's something hopeful about teaching. You're investing in the future. What about a family of your own? Husband, children? Another long pause. I used to think about that too, but I've seen what happens when women tie their entire lives to a man's success or failure. When Daddy died, Mama just gave up, like she didn't know how to exist without him. Not all marriages are like that. No, but enough are. I've seen too many women lose themselves completely, become nothing more than shadows of their husbands. I swore I'd never let that happen to me. What if you found a man who wanted a partner instead of a shadow? Maggie turned to look at him in the starlight, and something passed between them, a recognition, a possibility that neither was quite ready to name. I suppose that would be different, she said quietly. Yes, Zeke agreed. It would be. August brought its own challenges and rewards. The cattle were thriving, the garden was producing abundantly, and the ranch was beginning to feel like a true homestead rather than just a place where Zeke happened to live. It also brought a letter from the Dusty Creek School Board, delivered by a traveling preacher who made regular circuits through the scattered communities. The letter was addressed to Miss Magnolia Beaumont, care of the Morrison Ranch. Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she opened it, and Zeke found himself holding his breath as she read the single page. They're offering me the position, she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. That's wonderful news, Zeke replied, though his heart sank at the words. When would you start? The first week of September. They want me to come to town a week early to prepare the schoolroom and meet with the parents. So you'd be leaving soon? Yes. The word hung between them like a physical presence. All summer, they'd both known this moment would come, but somehow it had seemed distant, theoretical. Now it was real, and neither of them was prepared for how much it hurt. I could write to them, Maggie said suddenly. Tell them I've changed my mind, that I'm not available after all. You can't do that. Teaching is what you've always wanted, is it? I thought it was, but now I'm not so sure. These past months here, they've been the happiest of my life. The idea of leaving all this, leaving you. She stopped, color rising in her cheeks. Maggie, I know I'm speaking out of turn. I know our arrangement was supposed to be purely business. But I can't pretend anymore that's all it is for me. Zeke stood up abruptly and walked to the porch railing, gripping it with both hands. His mind was racing, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. It's not all business for me either, he said finally. Hasn't been for a long time. Then why does it feel like we're saying goodbye? Because maybe we are. Maybe that's how it has to be. Why? Maggie stood and moved to stand beside him. Help me understand. Zeke struggled to find the words. Because you deserve better than this. You deserve a man who can give you a fine house in town, pretty dresses, a social life with other educated people. You deserve someone who can match your intelligence and refinement. And you think you can't. I know I can't. I'm just a rancher. Maggie, I can offer you hard work, isolation, and an uncertain future. You could be a teacher, respected in the community, independent. Why would you give that up for this? Maggie was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the moonlit prairie. When she spoke, her voice was steady and sure. Because I love you, Ezekiel Morrison. I love your kindness, your integrity, your strength. I love the way you gentle a spooked horse and the way you look when you're watching the sunset. I love that you saw me as a person worth helping when I was at my lowest point. Zeke turned to face her, his heart in his throat. Maggie, I love this place we've built together. I love our morning conversations over coffee and our evening talks under the stars. I love the way you make me feel safe and valued and complete. But your dreams, my dreams have changed. Or maybe I just finally figured out what they really were. I don't want to be independent if it means being alone. I don't want respect from strangers if it means losing the love of the man who matters most to me. Zeke reached out and took her hands in his, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. Are you sure? Really sure? Because once you say yes, I'm never letting you go. I'm sure. Are you asking, Magnolia Beaumont, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my companion for whatever life brings us? Yes, she whispered. And then louder, yes, yes, yes. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her close as if he could press her into his very soul. When he finally released her enough to see her face, tears were streaming down her cheeks. Happy tears, she assured him quickly. The happiest tears of my life. When? He asked. When can we be married? Tomorrow, if you can find a preacher. I've waited long enough for my life to really begin. The traveling preacher, it turned out, was named Reverend Joshua Whitmore, and he was delighted to perform a wedding ceremony. He'd been staying at Murphy's trading post for the night, and when Zeke rode out at dawn to ask him, he agreed immediately. Nothing I like better than joining to hearts that have found their way to each other, he declared, his weathered face creasing into a smile. When do you want to do this? Today. If possible, Zeke replied. We don't need anything fancy, just legal and proper. Today it is. I'll need witnesses, of course. Murphy and his wife can stand for us, if they're willing, within hours. Word had spread through the small community. By afternoon, a surprising number of people had gathered at Murphy's trading post to witness the ceremony. Ranch hands, homesteaders, and travelers had all come to see Zeke Morrison marry the young woman who'd transformed his life. Maggie wore the dress she'd made from the blue calico, its simple lines complementing her natural beauty. She'd woven wildflowers into her auburn hair, and her violet eyes sparkled with joy and anticipation. Zeke had borrowed a clean shirt from Murphy and polished his boots until they gleamed. He felt nervous as a schoolboy, but when Maggie took his arm and they walked together to where Reverend Whitmore waited, his fears vanished. This was right. This was meant to be. Dearly beloved, the preacher began, his voice carrying easily over the assembled crowd. We are gathered here today to join Ezekiel Morrison and Magnolia Beaumont in holy matrimony. The ceremony was simple but moving. They spoke traditional vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other through whatever life might bring. When Reverend Whitmore pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the crowd could probably be heard for miles. Murphy had surprised them by preparing a wedding feast, complete with music provided by a traveling fiddler who happened to be passing through as the sun set. Couples danced under the stars while children played tag among the wagons and horses. Mrs. Morrison, Zeke said softly as they swayed together to a waltz. How does that sound? perfect," Maggie replied, her face glowing with happiness. "Absolutely perfect." They spent their wedding night in a small cabin behind the trading post that Murphy had decorated with wildflowers and clean linens. It was simple and humble, but it might as well have been a palace for how happy they were. "I love you," Zeke whispered as they lay together in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. "I love you too," Maggie replied. "More than I ever thought possible. No regrets. About the teaching position, about the life you're giving up. The only life I'm giving up is a lonely one. The life I'm choosing is full of love and partnership, and possibilities I never dreamed of." "What kind of possibilities?" "Children, maybe. Little ones to raise and love and teach right here on our ranch. A community to build, neighbors to help, a legacy to leave behind." Zeke tightened his arms around her, overwhelmed by the vision she painted. "Children would be wonderful. Then we'll work on that," she said with a soft laugh. "Among other things." "What other things?" "Making this ranch the best it can be. Building something that will last. Maybe even starting a school out here for the children of the homesteaders. There are enough families scattered around that we could probably manage it. You'd want to teach anyway." "I'd want to help however I can. Teaching, healing, whatever the community needs. But as your wife, not as a spinster schoolmarm. I love the way you think, Mrs. Morrison." "I love that I'm Mrs. Morrison." 1 year later, Zeke stood on the same porch where he'd first told Maggie about his dreams, watching her tend the garden that had grown into something magnificent under her care. She was singing softly to herself as she worked, her hands gentle among the plants, her face glowing with contentment. Their first year of marriage had brought challenges, as all marriages do, but it had also brought more joy than Zeke had thought possible. The ranch was thriving. Their herd had nearly doubled in size, and they'd added several improvements to the property. Most importantly, Maggie was expecting their first child, due in the early spring. The thought of becoming a father filled Zeke with a mixture of terror and excitement that he was still learning to navigate. "Zeke," Maggie called out, straightening from her work. "Come see what I found." He walked over to where she stood beside the tomato plants, her face bright with discovery. In her cupped hands, she held a small bird that had apparently fallen from its nest. "Poor little thing," she murmured, stroking its tiny head with one finger. "We need to help it." This was so typical of his wife, always ready to rescue something in need. Whether it was a fallen bird, a struggling neighbor, or a lonely cowboy in a saloon, her capacity for compassion never ceased to amaze him. They spent the evening caring for the bird, feeding it with a dropper and keeping it warm by the fire. By morning, it was strong enough to fly, and they watched it soar away into the dawn sky. "Think it'll make it?" Maggie asked, shading her eyes against the rising sun. "With your care to get it started, I'd say it has every chance in the world." "Like us," she said softly, leaning against his side. "Like us," he agreed. 2 months later, Maggie's prediction about starting a school came true when several homesteading families approached them about educating their children. They converted the old cabin where Maggie had first lived into a one-room schoolhouse, and by fall, she was teaching 8 children ranging in age from 6 to 14. "I never thought I could be this happy," she told Zeke one evening as they walked hand in hand around their property. "Even with all the hard work, the isolation, the uncertainty, especially because of those things, we're building something real. Here, something that matters. Our children will grow up knowing they're part of something larger than themselves. Children. Plural. Well, we can't stop at just one," she said with a mischievous smile. "This ranch needs plenty of little Morrisons to keep it going." Zeke laughed and pulled her closer. "Whatever you say, Mrs. Morrison. Whatever you say." 20 years later, the old porch had been expanded twice over the years, but Ezekiel Morrison still preferred his original chair in the corner, where he could watch the sunset paint the western hills in shades of gold and crimson. Beside him, Magnolia, still beautiful despite the silver threading through her auburn hair, rocked their newest granddaughter, while telling stories to the 3 older children clustered at her feet. The ranch had grown far beyond what either of them had envisioned that first day. The original 200 acres had expanded to over 1,000, supporting a substantial herd of cattle and employing several ranch hands. The school that had started with 8 children now served over 30, housed in a proper building they'd constructed 5 years earlier. Their own children, 4 sons and 2 daughters, had grown into capable adults. The eldest, Thomas, ran the day-to-day operations of the ranch with his father. Elizabeth taught at the school alongside her mother. The younger ones were still finding their paths, but all remained close to home and family. "Tell the story about how you met Grandpa," demanded 6-year-old Sarah, the most precocious of the grandchildren. Again, Maggie laughed. "I must have told that story 100 times. Please, Grandma." Zeke smiled as his wife launched into the familiar tale, the hungry young woman asking for leftovers, the cowboy who looked into her eyes and saw his future, the miracle that changed both their lives forever. "And they lived happily ever after," Sarah said with satisfaction when the story ended. "Are living happily ever after," Zeke corrected gently. "The story's not over yet." "Will it ever be over, Grandpa?" Zeke looked at his wife, surrounded by children and grandchildren on the porch of the home they'd built together, and shook his head. "No, little one, some stories are too good to ever really end." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Magnolia Morrison reached over and took her husband's weathered hand in her own. 68 years old now, she still felt the same spark of electricity that had passed between them that first night in the rusty Horseshoe Saloon. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing past the desperation to the woman underneath, for giving me a chance to prove myself, for building this life with me." "Thank you," Zeke replied, "for asking." "For my leftovers that night. Best decision I ever made was sharing my supper with a beautiful stranger, even if you knew then how it would turn out, especially knowing how it would turn out." Above them, the same stars that had witnessed their first conversation continued their eternal dance, and in the distance, cattle lowed contentedly in pastures that had known the touch for generations of Morrison hands. Some miracles, they both knew, were worth a lifetime of gratitude. Now that you've watched the full story, we'd really appreciate it if you could rate it out of 10 in the comments. Your thoughts help us improve and ensure we're bringing you the kind of storytelling you truly enjoy.